I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. MPs were back in the House of Commons today, bracing to tackle issues ranging from the pandemic and rebuilding the economy to climate change and Indigenous reconciliation. Anthony Rota was re-elected as Speaker of the House of Commons. Only fully vaccinated MPs who were in the House were able to vote for the Speaker. The House has to decide whether to resume hybrid sittings, which is something that the Conservatives and Bloc are against. Well, meanwhile, the government is telling MPs that they have until just before the holidays to pass a new round of pandemic aid. Government House Leader Mark Holland says a bill to approve billions in new aid for businesses still hurting from COVID-19 is one of 4 bills that the Liberals want passed by the middle of next month. Of the remaining 3, one bill would approve 10 days of paid sick leave for federally regulated workers. Another would ban conversion therapy that targets LGBTQ people. And the 4th would fulfill a campaign promise to criminalize the harassment of healthcare workers. Well, now that the first shipment of COVID-19 vaccines for children has arrived in Canada, provinces and territories are now gearing up for the next phase of the national mass immunization campaign. On Friday, Health Canada announced that it had approved a modified version of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine for use in children aged 5 to 11. Several provinces are expecting to release details on their immunization plans this week, with the goal of having hundreds of thousands of kids getting a first dose by Christmas. Now, despite having already received record rainfalls that triggered massive flooding and deadly mudslides in the past week, Environment Canada is warning of more wet weather on the way for British Columbia. The special weather statement has been issued for the North Coast. Another rainstorm is expected to move in on Wednesday or Thursday. Meanwhile, the federal government is waiving the requirement to show a record of employment in applying for employment insurance benefits for BC residents that were displaced or left jobless by the extreme flooding. Federal Employment Minister Carla Qualtrough says Ottawa is also looking at the fact that many people may already have exhausted their EI entitlements during the COVID-19 pandemic. She says people should apply anyway and that the federal government, quote, will figure this out for them one way or another. Air Canada says it has increased cargo capacity into and out of Vancouver in the wake of the flooding that cut highway links to the city. The airline says it has increased capacity to the city between November 21st and 30th from its hubs in Toronto, Montreal, and Calgary. Air Canada says it is using 28 wide-body aircraft instead of narrow-body ones to boost cargo capacity. It is also adding 13 all-cargo flights. In total, Air Canada says it is adding 586 tons of cargo capacity. 2 independent journalists were set for bail hearings in the BC Supreme Court this morning. They were taken into custody while covering a land rights protest between Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chiefs and Coastal GasLink near Houston. Lawyer Francis Mahone says freelance photojournalist Amber Bracken and documentary filmmaker Michael Toledano were among 15 people arrested on Friday. This comes as tensions grow over the natural gas pipeline running from northeast BC to Kitimat. The Canadian Association of Journalists has demanded the release of the pair and the intact return of all of their confiscated equipment. The federal telecom regulator opens hearings today into whether Rogers should be allowed to take over Shaw's broadcast business. The proposed $26 billion takeover includes cable networks in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, the satellite-based Shaw Direct TV service, and a satellite relay system. The CRTC will be looking at how the deal would affect everything from competition to local programming and the diversity of voices on television. Buyers of Tokyo Smoke cannabis products will be able to use the Uber Eats app to place pickup orders. Uber Technologies and Tokyo Smoke's parent company, Canopy Growth, says orders will be filled within an hour. The two companies say they are hoping that the promise will wrestle some sales away from illegal pot dealers. Consumers arriving to pick up orders will need to show ID to ensure they meet the age limit for buying cannabis. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency announced it is suspending all shipments of fresh potatoes from Prince Edward Island to the United States. This comes after the recent discovery of potato wart on several farms in the province. Potato wart is a fungal parasite spread through the movement of infected potatoes, soil, and farm equipment. It poses no threat to human health, but can greatly decrease the yield of potato crops. All right, stay tuned. We'll be right back after the break with a look at this week's federal throne speech. Stay with us. We'll be right back. The Governor General delivered the throne speech today, and it included a promise by the government to work with the provinces and territories on improving the healthcare system as the country emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic. With inflation running at an 18-year high last month, the federal government is also promising to tackle the rising cost of living. The government also promised bolder action on climate change and to stand up for diversity and inclusion. Reconciliation was another major theme of the speech, delivered partly in Inuktitut by Canada's first Indigenous Governor-General, Mary Simon. With us to unpack the speech from the throne and what to expect from Parliament is Mr. Elliott Hughes, Senior Advisor at Summa Strategies. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start with a quick overview of the speech from the throne itself.
Well, look, this was a very high-level throne speech. Not a lot of detail compared to the 2019 version. I think three things stood out for me. One, that high-level nature of it, not getting into too many policy details. Two, obviously calling out, what's happening out in British Columbia. I think that's on every Canadian's mind, hoping everyone is safe and sound there. And that, leads into one of the main themes that the government touched on, which is climate change and the environment. And then third, for me, this was Mary Simon's first throne speech as Governor General. You touched on it there in the opener. Great to see the progress that has been being made on that file, on the reconciliation file. Seeing a Governor General from Indigenous faith is fantastic, and shows that this is also another area that the government touched on during its throne speech as well.
And we saw a lot of key discussion points: reconciliation, climate change, healthcare. So from this overall speech, what do you think are the main priorities for the government right now?
Finishing the job against COVID-19 is number one for this government. They need to get that done and behind them so that the economy can pick back up. I would say environment is going to feature heavily in this parliament over the coming months, if not years. It is certainly a big focus for the Trudeau government, and you saw that today, but you also saw it from the election promises that it made. Reconciliation, which we just touched on, continues to be very close and important to the Prime Minister himself. And I would suspect with Mary Simon there as well, working together on some of those issues. Those would be the big three for me. And then finally, the fourth one, which is connected to some of those, is the economy, trying to rebuild the economy and that Build Back Better theme coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic.
And we know that on Monday, the government House leader outlined 4 bills to be passed before Christmas. So let's go over these 4 bills. And is it even possible to pass these bills before Christmas, this short timeline here?
Going to be very tight. It's going to be very tough over the next couple of weeks. Conversion therapy was one of them. Continued support for, more targeted COVID-19 support for specific industries were a couple of them. I think Mark Holland, a lot of the things that Mark Holland, the new House leader, talked about were echoed in today's throne speech. We'll see some of those more detailed ones, including, protecting the rights of healthcare workers as they go on their way to work, and that they're not harassed and so on. That will also be a key focus over the next couple of weeks, but certainly lots to get through. I would imagine come January, February, you'll start seeing them starting to tackle some of the larger issues a lot more.
All right, Mr. Hughes, and what are you expecting to be some of the other legislative priorities for the government?
We saw mental health being talked about in the throne speech today, but the big one that I will be keeping an eye on is housing. The government made plenty of predictions or promises, I should say, in the campaign, including tax rebates, and promising to build more houses, creating some new funds for new home buyers to access. That's going to be a big package for the government to get through. And certainly in today's economy, with housing prices where there are and people having that challenge of getting to that first home of theirs, this is going to be a big area of focus for the government. And I'm sure voters are going to be watching very carefully for that as well.
All right, Mr. Hughes, just about a minute left here, but considering we just got off an election in September, while this is a new parliament, in many ways it looks much like the previous one. So how are you expecting this parliament to function?
Unfortunately, it'll start off well, like most parliaments do, and then slowly start to, get worse and worse. But I do think that there is a chance for the government to be able to work more closely on targeted measures with the Bloc Québécois and the NDP. I don't think we should expect any formal agreements, but certainly there's a lot of alignment with each of the two opposition parties. And frankly, there's a lot of alignment with the Conservative Party and some of their policies. Will the Conservatives, want to work with the government? We'll have to see. Aaron O'Toole's much more internally focused at the moment. So I would suspect, like most minority parliaments, we'll see this last 18 to 24 months with the chance of it lasting a little bit longer.
All right, Mr. Elliott Hughes from Summa Strategies. Always great having you on Forum Daily, sir. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back with a look at child poverty with Campaign 2000, a coalition of groups working to end poverty in Canada. And it says at the current rate, it would take 54 years to end child poverty. An important conversation coming up next. 32 years ago, following the signing of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, Canada made a promise to eradicate child poverty by the year 2000. This is a promise that has yet to be fulfilled. A new report released today by the group Campaign 2000 says at the current rate, it would take 54 years for Canada to end child poverty. The National Coalition of 120 Advocates for Children and Families finds over 1.3 million Canadian children, or 17.7%, are living under the poverty line. Well, joining us now to provide us with a better understanding of child poverty in Canada and what needs to be done is Ms. Leila Sarangi, National Director of Campaign 2000. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me today.
So let's start with a brief overview of this report, how it was put together, and the main takeaways.
Yeah, so this is actually an annual reporting that we do. We've been, it's our 30th report card. We've been doing this since 1991 because after that promise was made, the rates of child poverty kept going up. We weren't seeing any difference in communities. And so we got together as a coalition and have been tracking that progress or lack of progress of the federal government in achieving the goal to end child poverty. So what we found this year, we were looking at the latest tax filer data that was available. So we're looking at 2019 numbers, setting up pre-pandemic context. And what we found was that, 1,313,000 children, that's 17.7% of all children in Canada are living in poverty. The gap between the rich and poor is widening, and families who are living in poverty are living in deeper poverty. That means they are further away from that poverty line than they have been since 2012.
Now, I'm sure when a lot of Canadians think about poverty, it's hard for them to picture a child going through it. So what does child poverty look like in Canada, and how is it measured?
So child poverty in Canada is pretty dire. So when we talk about that rate of 17.7%, it does hide a little bit who is living in poverty. So we know that if we look at the disaggregated data, for example, Status First Nations children living on reserve have a poverty rate of 53%. So that's more than 1 in 2 kids living on First Nations reserve live in poverty. And that looks like hunger, overcrowded housing, lack of access to services and medication. There's also very high rates of poverty above that national average for lone mother-led families, children with disabilities, racialized families, newcomer immigrant families. They all have higher rates of poverty, but the manifestations are the same. In the day-to-day, it's about not having enough to meet the basic needs. It's about parents who are working minimum wage jobs, often multiple minimum wage jobs, trying to, put things together, meet their daily needs, working long hours. Kids are hungry, and there's a lot of stigma still associated with that. So there's the mental health piece as well as the physical. There's the stress that's associated with it. There's the shame and the stigma that is also associated with it.
Now, you're mentioning certain demographics are being impacted. So what would you say are the root causes behind this societal inequality?
Yeah, so the report card looked at the systems in place. So there are a lot of barriers for these families to accessing certain programs. And I'll use the Canada Child Benefit as one example because we talk about that a lot in our report. The Canada Child Benefit in its current form, it has the potential to go a long way towards eradicating child poverty. But the challenge is that one, there's not enough of it to go around so that those families who are in deep poverty are not getting enough of that benefit to lift them up to the low income measure. But there's also eligibility criteria that is arbitrary and denies certain families eligibility. So for example, families who have precarious immigration status, their children may be born here, they may be citizens of Canada, but if the parents applying have precarious immigration status, they're here, they're working, they're paying into the income tax system, they're denied access to that federal benefit because the federal benefit is arbitrarily tied to their immigration status of the parents. And so that's like one example of the kinds of systemic barriers that are, throughout all kinds of systems, from healthcare to housing to accessing childcare and income supports.
All right, ma'am, just about 10 seconds left here, but if our viewers would like to have more information on this, where can they visit your website?
Please visit our website. It's www.campaign2000.ca, and there's the national report card and our provincial and territorial report cards there as well.
All right, ma'am, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
More news from around the world when we come back. The deaths of at least 27 people in the English Channel is fueling tensions between the UK and France. It is over how to stop migrants from crossing the world's busiest waterway in small boats. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and French President Emmanuel Macron have pledged to do everything possible to stop people smugglers from endangering lives. But politicians on both sides of the Channel are already sniping at their counterparts for failing to prevent Wednesday's tragedy. Australia says it is sending police, troops, and diplomats to the Solomon Islands under the terms of a bilateral security agreement. This is to help after anti-government demonstrators defied lockdown orders and took to the streets for a second day in violent protests. Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare declared the lockdown on Wednesday. This was after 1,000 people gathered in protest in the capital, demanding his resignation over various domestic issues. The government says the protesters breached the National Parliament building and set fire to other buildings, including a police station. The international law enforcement body known as Interpol on Thursday elected a contentious official from the United Arab Emirates as its new president. Major General Ahmed Nasir Al Raisi, Inspector General at the UAE's Interior Ministry, was elected for a 4-year term today at Interpol's annual General Assembly in Istanbul. He has been accused by human rights groups of involvement in torture and arbitrary detentions. Germany has become the latest country to surpass 100,000 deaths from COVID-19 since the pandemic began in March 2020. Germany's disease control agency said today it recorded 351 additional virus-related deaths over the past 24 hours. That took the total toll to 100,119. Germany is the 5th country to pass that mark in Europe after Russia, the United Kingdom, Italy, and France. The European Union's drug regulator has authorized Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine for use on children ages 5 to 11. Thursday's decision clears the way for shots to be administered to millions of elementary school children on the continent. This comes amid a new wave of infections sweeping across Europe. Starting in December, Poland will cut taxes on fuel and energy. This while offering bonuses next year to counter inflation that has reached its highest level since 2001. On Thursday, Premier Mateusz Morawiecki said the so-called anti-inflation shield will cost the government some 10 billion zlotys, or $2.4 billion. He blamed the 6.8% inflation on Russia's gas policy, EU climate policy, and on bonuses that were paid out to help businesses survive the pandemic. Russian media reports say at least 52 people have died after a fire at a coal mine in Siberia. Rescuers found 14 bodies, but were forced to halt the search for 38 others due to a buildup of carbon monoxide fumes. Media reports say emergency officials believe there is no chance of finding other survivors. Thousands of Sudanese took to the streets in the capital of Khartoum to renew their demand for a civilian government. Thursday's rallies came just days after the military signed a power-sharing deal with the prime minister. It saw him released from house arrest and reinstated as the head of the government. The deal came almost a month after the generals orchestrated a coup that saw the premier deposed and dozens of politicians and activists detained. Sudan's key pro-democracy groups and political parties have dismissed the deal as falling short of their demands for a fully civilian rule. A large explosion outside a school in Somalia's capital Thursday morning killed at least 8 people, including students, and wounded 17. The extremist group Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility for the attack in Mogadishu. The Philippines' defense chief has rejected China's renewed demand that it remove its outpost on the disputed South China Sea. Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana said Thursday the Chinese Coast Guard ships should leave the area and stop blocking Manila's supply boats toward the Second Thomas Shoal. The defense chief added that a 2016 ruling by a UN-backed arbitration tribunal also invalidated China's claims. China has repeatedly asked the Philippines to evacuate the shoal that it claims in one of the world's busiest waterways. Manhattan's annual Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade was back after being kept away last year. The Thanksgiving Parade is the latest U.S. holiday event to make a comeback. This comes as vaccines, familiarity, and sheer frustration make some officials more comfortable with big gatherings. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.